let's go to our first fireside event on supply chain sustainability. It's always a pleasure to introduce our next guest. She is Sheri Hinish, Principal Global Sustainability, Innovation and Ecosystem Leader at EY.
Hello. Hi, Sean.
How are you?
Great. How are you?
Very well. Very well. You're looking all professionally mic'd up there, Sheri.
Proper miking.
So, Sheri, I thought sustainability is one of those subjects that is so vast and all-encompassing that I often get the feeling that many businesses don't quite know where to start, that they can't quite see the wood for the trees sometimes. And I was just wondering if maybe you could share with us just a couple of use cases maybe that you've come across that you think really encapsulate what's possible with a little bit of positive thinking and positive action, something that would sort of maybe act as a little bit of inspiration or guidance to companies who maybe are struggling to find their way a little bit.
Sure thing, Sean. So I think the good news, and it's always great to start with good news, is that as supply chain and procurement leaders, practitioners, we do have that muscle memory in some of the more classic lean optimization levers, and even risk management and resiliency, as Todd just alluded to, from Process Unity. I think what's changing is a lot of the regulatory environments where it's not enough to say that you don't know. If it's happening in your supply chain, if it's happening deeper in your supply base upstream in tiers 3 through 5, you're still accountable for those activities and those behaviors. And we are going to get to a couple examples of innovative use cases throughout this chat. But I do just want to set the intention that, when I look cross-sector in some of the work that I lead at EY and then previously at IBM, ESG data underpins this new lens through which we're opening our aperture. So incubating innovation, scaling it. And I think a lot of what's changed and where folks might feel some of that uncertainty or not know what the first right step is the global push for carbon accounting and greenhouse gas emissions reporting. So this is happening at an unprecedented level. There are many regulations, and I'm not going to give everyone an acronym soup, but what ends up happening is the ripple effect and how it shows up in global supply chain organizations, where you're now responsible for investigating, reporting, and more importantly, mitigating, and you're accountable for what's happening, even things that might happen outside of that view that you see through your lens. So specifically to double click on what Todd just said, suppliers are now being asked to detail a lot of their emissions profiles and human rights due diligence. When I think about scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting, and I'm going to double click specifically on how this underpins a lot of the innovation, scope 3 emissions is an opportunity for companies, when you look in the broader context of what's happening, to understand climate risk, to use carbon as a leading indicator for a lot of the social initiatives, protecting that social license to operate in communities where you have your manufacturing plants, communities that you source things like high-risk commodities, and also making sure that you show up in the world more holistically with some of the emerging regulations around nature and biodiversity, water management, TNFD, for example. So all of this can be underpinned as not only innovation, but being a good steward and the sea change of what great looks like. It's no longer enough to say, we have financial KPIs and growth at all costs and all of the things that we have been trained classically as supply chain and procurement leaders to have as our North Star. ESG data is the new North Star. The Sustainable Development Goals, that integrated vision for moving together, is our roadmap for a sustainable supply chain. So I am going to unpack one use case, and I have said that I'm going to try and leave out customer names and also some of the technology vendors, because I don't think that that's fair for me to, necessarily give a spotlight on those folks, especially if I'm under NDA. But there's one very well-known example in consumer. So think consumer product and retail. And this is a company that was bold and took a chance, and it's paid off. So one of the most, I think, notable initiatives is connecting consumer behavior and everyday purchases and helping human beings across their supply chain make better decisions. They've done a ton of work in life cycle assessments, and the web tool that they use, called Footprint Chronicles, allows consumers even to use traceability and provenance. So this is a way to look at a bill of material, all of those material flows, all of the energy metrics, sometimes even fair living wage, whether that was observed, the type of chemicals, the type of material inputs that are in that BOM, and then specific to what we're talking about, the environmental footprint end to end. So this includes where the product's made, working conditions, transportation information, and that unlocking that data, and I think providing that transparency for anyone. Wow, that's a really vulnerable space for a lot of us, because we're not used to doing that. We typically hold our data, very close to the vest, and it historically used as competitive advantage. And I think that's the other sea change. When we look at innovation, we look at people collaborating and openly sharing. The other thing about this company is they use a very high percentage of recycled materials in their products. So when they look at things like LCA, they are including the entire product lifecycle management, including designing for a reverse infrastructure and how to incentivize consumers to return that material so it can be then downcycled into other goods, or even the right to repair is something that they use very frequently. Wornware is that trade-in program where customers can actually use clothing for store credit, or they can actually be encouraged to extend the life cycle of products and ultimately reduce waste and avoid landfill. I think lastly, and this is one of the things that I talked about at COP27 last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, is the overwhelming need to invest in regenerative agriculture. So looking at soil quality as an indicator for addressing things like the climate emergency, and also empowering smallholders, over 25 million smallholders, in communities that frankly are already being marginalized, giving them data and skills in STEM and environmental management to also show how they're contributing to eco-services, enriching the soil, looking at optimal planting patterns, harvesting, and then sharing those signals with that parent brand. So that is one very long-winded answer.
No, long-winded at all. That's very insightful, and it's interesting that you're talking about consumers a lot there, Sheri, because in some senses it's consumers are key stakeholders, aren't they, in sustainability, driving the need for change on a sort of enterprise level. But we're seeing with increasing cost inflation globally, particularly in energy and foods, that it's making it tough for consumers to follow through with sustainable purchases, because they can be pricier than less sustainable purchases. And I think we're seeing a little bit of a softening on positioning for sustainability in consumers. Are you sensing any softening in the world of enterprise, industry, commerce, retail, compared to, say, a couple of years ago, maybe?
It's a great question. And the reason I mention consumer a lot is because when I wake up every morning, I want to help humans make better, more responsible decisions. And we are all consumers, and we don't divorce our values and our why when we walk into the office, whether it's a physical office or a virtual office. So with that in mind, I don't necessarily see a softening. What I see is more investment in specifically in technology. I think that it's a great enabler and accelerator. I also see more financing the gap. You're right. And I've had this debate many, many times with Dr. Yossi Sheffi around, what's really holding us back. And it's interesting because I think that when you, and again, I'm coming from, an opinion, I am not struggling financially. There were points in my life where I was. But when you have that choice, does 5, 10 cents, a dollar make a difference? And I think it does. But I don't see the investment in sustainable products softening because I do see people balancing their portfolio and their hurdle rates differently in order to finance investment in sustainable products. But that underpinning technology is tied to so many other things. And I think that a lot of the costs that are perceived are actually becoming more normalized because you also have regulatory pressures. You also have pressures from investors, and ultimately making that information more transparent is going to lower your cost of capital. I think the other side of it too is, we're talking about supplier relationships. Access to capital is huge. And it's frankly, it's not fair to put a lot of these scope 3 emission requirements on a lot of our smaller suppliers, diverse suppliers, and sort of throw it over the fence. The good news is, though, again, I really like to talk about the good news, is that there are incentives. So a lot of the evolving sustainability tax policies include measures that help you incentivize and finance the right behaviors. Specifically at EY, we have a green tax tracker that will help you not only monitor a lot of the evolving tax policies, but help you cash in and help you finance a lot of those projects that may not be totally understood, that might have a little bit of a longer ROI, but ultimately help you meet your commitment around net zero, carbon neutrality, and raise revenue, frankly, to fund other important Horizon 2, Horizon 3 innovation. So staying on top of supply chain tax policy, I think is something that you can use pragmatically to help bridge the gap in that financing. All the carbon pricing regimes that are emerging, environmental taxes, I think that's the other thing. You really have to make sure that you are including that also in your overall ROI. One last thing, if you're stateside, the IRA, so this is Inflation Reduction Act, you think about, I think there's 24 available tax credits. And this is going to drive ultimately $380 billion of investment into renewable energy, sustainable technologies. And those are the things that are going to open up new areas, and they underpin a lot of the sustainable goods and services that we're talking about right now. So that's going to also help you when you get to your business case.
And there are comparable sort of tax relief and tax incentivization schemes sort of in Europe as well, aren't there, around sustainability? So that kind of leads us into the next kind of area, Sheri, which is, how do enterprises, organizations sort of, stay on this high wire, or perform this high wire balancing act between profitability on the one side, sustainability on the other, in the face of all kinds of headwinds and, disruptions and distractions. How do companies best achieve that balance between those two things?
Yeah, I'm not gonna say, oh, it's easy, because this is tough stuff. Okay, it's tough stuff. It's tough to remain competitive. I think one of the things that sometimes people, it feels very daunting, but when done correctly, it can actually enhance your profitability and competitiveness. So I'm going to start with The first thing, which I've seen time and time again, and what I try to infuse in a lot of the project and co-creation work that I do, is putting humans at the center of transformational sustainability. So the investment isn't just technology and digital transformation. It's also investing in your people, digital literacy, STEM education that underpins a lot of the sustainability management, and helping people understand how they're connected to something much larger than themselves, because this is going to give you more informed and responsible decision making that reshapes why and how work gets done. Some of the strategies that clients are using, and it's really simple. In terms of, I think a lot of folks can tap into this. Some of the EH&S transformation, efficiency, waste reduction, can we reduce more waste? Probably. Can we go outside of our four walls? Is there always opportunity to use resources more efficiently, which is tied to significant cost savings? Almost every single time, I still see value being left on the table, which ultimately will not only minimize waste, and a lot of the LCA work, scalable LCA work that's being done in ESG reporting will give you a clear, visible path to how that's showing up. Good for business, good for the planet. I think the other thing is innovating, differentiating. So by adopting sustainable practices that often include innovation, so new products, new services, tapping into your supply base through supplier collaboration, these are things, investing in your people, that are ultimately going to set you apart and make you more competitive. It also gives you a lot of the brand eminence if you're able to really prove and document that you do what you say you're doing. It can be a differentiator in the marketplace. And I think more importantly, what I'm seeing is, within the next, 2 to 3 years, half the workforce are going to be comprised of millennials. And beyond millennials, I think it's just a values-based economy where I wouldn't work for a bad actor. I don't want to, like many people that I know, like, we want to show up and we want to be proud of the work that we do. Another way to balance a lot of the, lowest cost, lowest price paradigm is the sea change around risk. And I don't want to belabor what Todd said before, because I thought his presentation was absolutely amazing. I think that mitigating risk like resource scarcity, price volatility, especially tied to high-risk commodities, but then also looking at how we've designed our processes in supply chain, those disruptions now being able to codify the impact of why we need duplication across our supply base, why we need to make sure that social issues, human rights, due diligence, and compliance are front and center, because all of these things ultimately lead to long-term stability, long-term resiliency. And I think if human rights due diligence isn't on your list of priorities, it should be. I've worked with a couple of the biggest brands, specifically in CPG, which is where I started my journey in supply chain. And if you have 122 grievances, even if you're the largest, most, I guess, revered sustainable CPG brand in the world, there is a punitive impact. There are fines, there's brand reputation and degradation that happens, and people choose. So reputation and brand value, still being able to demonstrate that commitment. And this happens now, okay? This is really important because the internet never dies. And I know that you alluded to premium pricing of product and services. I don't think we should charge more. I don't think that doing the right thing should be more expensive. And like I mentioned, I think we're still evolving. Is it an ever evolving space? Yes. But what does higher levels of trust among your customers, among your employees and your investors and shareholders, what does that mean? Ultimately, it's going to be tied to the cost of money. And that is how a lot of things will change in the next 3 to 5 years in working core banking in FS. Access to capital, regulatory compliance, all of these things I think people are integrating into their sustainable supply chain practices, but more importantly, their strategic planning, and not treating it as something separate off to the side. It's a shift in mindset, shift in culture, and it does provide significant benefits in terms of competitiveness, profitability in the long run.
Now, I mean, you did mention earlier on, Sheri, that you didn't feel it was fair for larger companies to, well, not bully, but to be quite robust in the way that they demand their vendors to adhere to this or that regulation, or to be compliant of this and that way. But I've also heard it said more than once, actually, that if every single company in the world took care of their own scope 1 and 2 emissions, then scope 3 would take care of itself. So is there a balance to be struck there between smaller companies being proactive in how they become more sustainable, but also larger enterprises helping them along that journey with this or that degree of robustness? I just wondered what your view on that was.
I love that point, Sean, because everyone's scope 3 is someone else's scope 1 and 2. And I think it's also really changing the narrative around why carbon is important and why reporting on more broadly environmental measures is tied to so many things. If we just step back for a second and look at these sustainable development goals. So this is a 2030 vision integrated across people, planet, economic benefits, and more importantly, impact, how it actually transforms the lives of people and doesn't leave people behind. In the climate emergency, the social emergency, and the business model emergency. Under all of those targets across 17 integrated goals, climate touches 84%. So when you talk about climate, I think sometimes we don't actually call it out as business leaders, and we don't say the climate emergency is going to impact our business and how we show up in the world. And sometimes the ROI is breathable air. I'm going to answer your question. I promise. I just want to bring it to life. 3 weeks ago, I live in Maryland. There were significant forest fires in Canada. The sky was orange where I live. And for 8.5 days, we could not walk outside and breathe because the air quality was so poor. Schools were canceled, games were canceled, activities were canceled. Buckle up. This is why this is important. Scope 3 emissions, I think, when you don't wrap around codes of conduct and the right education, that is super important. Proactively addressing the skills gap. So think training, capacity building. This is going to help suppliers and people who should be viewed as partners and collaborators understand why. What's the effective practice in the long term? What are the business benefits? And it's cost savings, it's increased efficiency, but there are also conduits in how that shows up in other areas, in the communities where you operate, providing things like a fair living wage. These are wages that are above collective bargaining agreements typically. People spend differently when you collaborate with diverse suppliers. That dollar with a diverse supplier versus a business as usual supplier, if you follow it, it's going to show up differently in your community. It's going to show up differently in your local economy. Think about access to healthcare, access to education. You can't just look at the KPI that you're after. So obviously there are other things, I think, around scope 3 emissions, incentivizing the behavior. It shows up in contracts. That's one thing. I think that can sort of lighten the adoption, the on-ramping, but it's going to require a willingness to potentially, pay a little bit more and make sure that you are properly compensating people if they do make the right investments and change the behaviors, and it shows up in their services and products, that it's fair. So, financing scale up of sustainable technologies, it can come with challenges, but I think I am seeing a sea change in big brands helping fund some of the upfront investments in physical assets, in large scale facility and infrastructure transformation. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention around scope 3, where I have seen, success in promoting sustainability has been around cross-sector collaboration. So think about, suppliers, their operational, enhancing things like vertical integration, where you all win together. There's an example of a car manufacturer who recently announced a joint venture with a circular materials technology company. And the use case was to boost the supply of low carbon battery materials. So this collaboration, it inevitably, I think there was a demand within the next 12 months to meet over 2 million EVs per year. And what this does is this partnership, it not only helps fortify the transition in mobility using supply chain for battery recycling, but it also helps solidify demand for people across the EV and energy storage supply chain. So think charging infrastructure, grid storage markets. And this is ultimately going to help reduce the commercial risk for investors. There is another example in specialty chemicals, and again, using sustainable technology suppliers in another advanced recycling use case where think about looking across a network of multiple recycling facilities for plastic that is not only going to increase capacity, because we don't have the capacity, even if we said everyone recycle plastics right now in the United States, we don't have the infrastructure to actually receive those materials and properly handle them with minimal impacts to human health and to climate. But using folks, bringing them together, rallying around purpose, again, connecting the why with how work gets done, you can't underpin that. And for anybody who's in consulting or anybody who's in an internal consulting role and they're trying to position the business case, what keeps you up at night and what gets you out of bed in the morning? Two different things oftentimes. It's a different mindset and headspace. So just remember that as you think about positioning, a lot of these maybe smaller use cases or bigger net zero commitments and ambitions, we have to do this. It's the right thing to do. And I think sometimes that can get muted or lost in sustainable supply chain transformation.
Thanks for that, Sheri. Well, we're nearly out of time, but I think we probably just squeeze in one more talking point, Sheri. Now, you mentioned earlier on what great looks like, and that's changing all the time, isn't it? It's certainly changed since pre-pandemic times, almost out of all recognition. But I'm just curious to hear your view on what do you think great will look like in 5 years' time, say?
Yeah. So I used to say that, great depends on your sector. I think that there are high impact sectors that we absolutely have to focus on transforming, specifically around energy management and the clean transition, power and utilities, oil and gas, the folks. But I've amended my opinion recently in working specifically in financial services, which I haven't dabbled in my past engagements with customers. Now my answer is capital, access to capital, because I think, a lot of folks are rallying around ESG reporting and how important it is. And it absolutely is. I'm not belittling that. But even if you can see it, Sean, would you make a different decision? And that next best action and the things that happen after due diligence, compliance, and reporting, that's transformation. And I don't think that they're the same thing. So what great looks like for me would be a lot of our folks in core banking and FS, if you're watching, really help people understand, because you have access cross-sector in your customer base to help folks on this journey of unlocking some of the ESG data that they need, of them also rallying around net zero commitments, which are ultimately tied to your scope 3 emissions, as you alluded to, Sean, and getting clear on what are the decarbonization levers that are most material, that are highest impact, and that are going to add the most value for that sector, in helping folks fund that activity. Then being transparent and reporting it, and celebrating the wins, and also openly sharing what hasn't worked. I think so many times folks, they're all after the splashy PR announcements, but we don't do a good job of sharing and harvesting what didn't work and what the learnings are. And there are tons of communities of practice that are emerging now. The Sustainable Procurement Pledge, SPP.Earth. I know you've probably had Thomas Udison at another event. I think we were in a panel together a couple years ago. That's a great example. Providing that free collateral. WBCSD is another organization, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Say that 3 times. They open a ton of stuff around transparency. So partnerships for, really crisp carbon accounting, evolving standards, the technical specifications. Folks, it's all at your fingertips and it's free. Part of it's access to finance, the other access to information, hard-earned lessons, what's worked, what hasn't. That's what great looks like in the next 1 to 2 years. It's all around mobilizing, partnering, and creating the right access to information and money that we're really going to need to address the climate emergency and the social emergency.
And actually, we're going to a network break any second, but I have had a question through here from one of our remote audience members, Sheri. He or she doesn't give a name, but the question is, what are your thoughts on the emerging supply chain due diligence acts coming out of Europe? And do you think the US will implement the same? I know there's the Uyghur Act that was, came into force in January this year. But so that's just wonder what you thought about that, Sheri.
Yeah, so CSRD, and also my German is horrible. Oh gosh, Lieferkeitengesetz, Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. A lot of what is in the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act is actually addressed in CSRD. And the company that I work for, we do have some free thought leadership assets to sort of help you organize around those emerging regulations and understand how it will impact you financially in the near term, and also what type of capabilities you need to invest in to accurately and credibly report against those standards and those regulations. What's interesting is I think it is going to happen in the US. We already have modern slavery legislation. You mentioned the Uyghur Act. I have said in previous panels, and especially the work done with Freedom, FRDM, and Justin Dillon, the CEO there, that human rights due diligence can actually be a leading indicator for operational efficiency. Because what happens oftentimes is when folks evolve and they really start looking at social enterprise, community impact, doing the right thing with people really at the center of that, most of the time, those organizations and brands are already doing a lot of the eco-efficiency, material efficiency, operational efficiency projects, initiatives, and transformation. So they've evolved onto human rights. I think it should be the other way around, frankly. But yeah, I do think it's happening. It's going to continue to happen. And I mean, you should care about if you have child labor, forced labor, slave labor in your supply chain. As a mother of 3 children, my gosh, if I knew that a brand, and this has happened, if a brand, didn't really care, would it change my decision in purchasing or supporting that brand and that good? Hell yeah, it would. It would. So yes, to answer your question, it's coming. CSRD, stateside, it will happen.
Thank you for that, Sheri. And sadly, that really is all time we have now. It's been an absolute pleasure as ever speaking with you, Sheri. It's always hugely insightful, and I'm sure our audience would agree with that. So we wish you all the very best, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks, BizClick, for inviting me.
You're welcome, Sheri. Thank you very much, Sheri Hinish.